Montana Territory, July of 1879. The sun beat down hard on the dirt road leading into Dry Creek, and by the time she stumbled into town, her boots were torn, her dress stuck to her back with sweat, and her hands hung limp at her sides. She had nothing, not even a name she wanted to say aloud. The woman paused just past the edge of the main street, blinking against the dust and the stairs. A freight wagon rumbled by, sending up a fresh cloud that stung her eyes. She stepped aside, dragging her feet, and leaned against the post outside a shuttered general store. Her stomach cramped, hollow from days without food, and her mouth felt like cotton. A man across the street noticed her. Broad-shouldered, with a worn hat pulled low over eyes the color of pine bark, he stood beside a buckskin mare and squinted through the heat. He said something to the blacksmith beside him, then crossed the road. "You all right, miss?" His voice was low, gentle. "You look like you have not eaten in a while." She looked up at him, too tired to lie. "I have not." He did not ask for her name. He just nodded once, slow and sure, and said, "Come on. Diner's just around the corner. They have stew and cornbread." She blinked. "Why would you help me?" The corner of his mouth lifted, not in amusement but in something steadier. "Because someone should." She followed. The diner was nothing more than a sagging building with a cracked window and a sign faded from sun, but it smelled like heaven inside: meat and onions and something warm. The cowboy tipped his hat to the woman behind the counter and said, "2 bowls, please." "She goes first." She sat down slowly, like she was not sure if she belonged there. He sat across from her and watched, silent, while she ate. She did not speak until her bowl was scraped clean. "Thank you," she said, voice low. "I had not had a hot meal in I do not know how long." He nodded. "You got a place to stay?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No." "You got a name?" She looked down at her hands. "Sylvie Ellard." He held out his hand across the table. "Wade Ellison." She looked up, startled. "Same initials." He chuckled softly. "Guess that means something." Sylvie managed a faint smile, but it faded fast. "I do not have anything, Wade. I was traveling with my brother. We were heading to Helena. He got into a fight with a man outside of Miles City. Gun went off. He did not make it." Wade's jaw shifted. "I'm sorry. I walked the last 3 days, thought maybe there'd be work here or a church that could help, but now I don't even know what I came for." Her voice cracked. "There is nothing left." Wade leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Well, you got me. That counts for something." She stared at him like she was not sure she had heard right. "I got a small place just outside town," he said. "Old homestead. Good roof. Room to rest. You can stay there at least until you get your feet under you." Sylvie swallowed hard. "You do not even know me." Wade looked her square in the eye. "You came here with nothing. That takes grit. I respect that. Besides, I figure people don't need to know everything about each other to be kind." She wiped at her cheek, surprised to find tears there. "I do not know what to say. Just say yes." Outside, the sun had started to drop, casting the town in long shadows as they stepped back onto the street. Wade helped her onto his horse and walked beside her, leading the way out of town. His place was modest, a one-room cabin at the edge of a narrow creek, surrounded by pine and cottonwood. Firewood was stacked neatly against the wall. A porch swing creaked in the breeze. He helped her down and guided her inside. The room smelled like cedar. A cot sat in the corner, clean and made up with a quilt. She turned to him, eyes wide. "You live here alone?" "Have for years," Wade said. "After my folks passed, I kept it going. Got a few head of cattle, and I break horses for the army sometimes. Keeps me fed." Sylvie set her bundle, just a threadbare coat and a cracked Bible, on a stool. "Why are you helping me?" Wade rubbed the back of his neck. "Because I know what it feels like to lose everything. And because you look like you could use someone steady." She nodded slowly, then lowered herself onto the cot. I won't take more than I need. You can stay as long as you like, he said simply. I mean that. That night, in the quiet of the cabin, Sylvie lay awake listening to the crickets outside. She heard Wade moving around the porch, probably checking the fence or the gate. Everything about him was calm, solid, kind in a way that did not expect anything in return. She had never known that kind of kindness from a man. In the morning, Wade handed her a tin mug of coffee and a plate of fresh bread with honey. She watched him move around the cabin, fixing a loose board, feeding the chickens, and it filled her chest with something she had not felt in a long time: hope. By the fourth day, she was helping with the cooking. By the seventh, she was fixing the fence alongside him, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back. You take to work pretty fast, he said, handing her a nail. I like being useful. You are more than useful, Sylvie. She paused, fingers tightening around the hammer. Wade looked at her, steady and quiet. You do not have to be scared of being wanted. She did not answer, but that night she made stew, and they ate side by side on the porch, passing the cornbread between them, watching the last of the light fade over the creek. When he reached over and rested his hand on hers, she did not pull away. For the first time in weeks, she felt something bloom inside her that was not grief. She looked at him and whispered, You said I had nothing, but maybe I was wrong. Wade's voice was rough. You were not wrong. You just had not found it yet. She leaned against his shoulder and he let her. Neither of them moved for a long time. The late summer morning came with a hush, the sort that settled deep into the pine, where the wind ran slow and cool. Sylvie stood knee-deep in the creek at the edge of Wade's land, breeches rolled and hems soaked through. She didn't look back toward the cabin. Not yet. She focused on the pale stones beneath the water, how they shifted with the current, how her toes gripped and gave. Behind her, a woodpecker knocked softly at a distant trunk. She dipped her hands into the stream, rubbing away the last of the ash from the cook fire she'd cleaned out before dawn. Wade had gone down to the south fence just after breakfast, said something about a calf getting tangled in the wire. He hadn't asked her to come. He didn't ask things of her much at all. When she returned to the cabin, she found a bundle wrapped in burlap resting on the porch bench. 3 folded dresses inside worn, but clean, and a pair of work gloves that looked near new. She stepped back as Wade came up the path, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Where'd you get these? She asked, lifting the edge of one sleeve. Mrs. Rowley over by the church was clearing out her cellar. Said she didn't have use for them anymore. Did she know you were bringing them to me? He leaned against the post, gaze steady. I said they were for someone who could wear 'em with pride. She didn't argue. Sylvie folded the fabric slowly, pressing the creases smooth with her palm. You didn't have to ask for me. I didn't, he said. Just mentioned you were here. She looked at him then, really looked, and found no pity in his face, just a quiet patience that made her throat tighten. Wade, what is this between us? Her voice was barely above the breeze. He didn't answer right away. You ever work a team on a wagon? No. Well, he said, you don't get far if you're pulling in opposite directions. Doesn't matter how strong one of you is. She sat down on the bench beside the bundle. So you think we're a team? I think we could be. She laced her fingers together. I haven't had a thought about what comes next. Not really. I've just been putting one foot in front of the other. That's all right, Wade said. I've been standing still too long. She didn't speak again until the sun had dropped lower, casting long gold lines through the trees. Then, without looking at him, she asked, What happened to her? He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. She left, he said. Didn't like the quiet. Said she needed more than fence posts and sky. Sylvie nodded once. And still you stayed. Wasn't the land's fault, he said. Wasn't mine either. Some folks need noise to feel alive. She turned toward him. And you, I need steadiness. something real enough to hold on to when the wind kicks up. That night, she took one of the dresses from the bundle and wore it to supper. The fabric was faded blue, the kind that matched the sky just before dusk. She caught his eyes lingering, but he didn't say anything. Just passed her the skillet and poured her coffee, same as always. Later, she stood in the doorway watching the stars come out. Wade was whittling on the porch rail, thin curls of pine falling to his boots. "I used to think I'd marry a man who ran a store," she said, voice low. "Someone who'd never have dirt under his nails, someone who read books and quoted scripture. And now," she looked toward the trees, "now I think I just want someone who shows up each morning and doesn't leave when I break a little." Wade didn't speak. He set down the knife, brushed sawdust from his lap, and stood. "You're not broken, Sylvie. You're just tired from carrying things too long alone." She stepped onto the porch. "You make things sound easy." "No," he said, "just worth the trouble." She didn't reach for him, not yet. But she stood close enough to feel the warmth of his arm beside hers, close enough to know that if she leaned, he'd hold steady. And something shifted inside her. Not like a flood, but like a gate unlatched, quiet, deliberate, sure. The weather turned cooler the following week, though the sun still climbed high by noon. Sylvie took to rising early, long before the light reached the tops of the cottonwoods, and setting the kettle to boil while the cabin still held the night's chill. She'd begun mending Wade's worn shirts in the evenings, small, neat stitches that gave her hands something to do. He didn't comment on it, only wore them without fuss when the patches were done. One afternoon, she found herself standing in the overgrown garden out back, weeds high and tangled around the forgotten rows. She crouched and pulled a handful of thistle from the soil, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist. The earth was tough, but not past saving. Wade's voice came from behind her. "Didn't figure you for the gardening type." "I'm not," she said, not looking up, "but it feels wrong to let good ground go to waste." He crossed his arms, watching her. "There's seed in the barn. Old, but might take if you're patient." She brushed dirt from her palms. "Patience I've got." Later, after supper, Wade brought out a tin box from beneath the floorboards. Inside were yellowed envelopes and a folded land deed. He set it on the table between them. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what it means keeping a place like this going." Sylvie met his gaze. "You thinking of selling?" He shook his head. "The opposite." She waited. "This land's free and clear," he said. "No debt on it. My folks made sure of that. I've just been holding it down, but that's not the same thing as building something. Not really." She touched the edge of the paper. "What are you saying, Wade?" He leaned forward, arms braced on the table. "I'm saying I want this to be more than a place I sleep and work. I want it to be home." "Not just for me." Sylvie's breath caught. "You mean with me?" "I do." She stood slowly, folding her arms to still the tremble in her fingers. "I've never had land in my name, never even had a home I could count on longer than a season." "You could," he said. "You can. If you want." She looked over at the window where the lamplight softened the edges of the dark. "You sure about this?" "I wouldn't say it if I wasn't." She turned back to him, voice quiet. "Then I'll stay, not just for now, for good." The next morning, Wade brought her into town. She walked beside him, not behind, her chin lifted just enough to meet the eyes of the folks they passed. They stopped at the mercantile, and he bought her a spool of cotton thread and a small journal with a cracked leather cover. "Thought you might want a place to put things down," he said, handing it to her. "Things you don't want to forget." She traced her fingers over the binding. "I've spent so long trying to forget, I wouldn't have known where to start." "Maybe start with today," he said. "Seems like a fine one." That evening, she wrote the first line in the book while Wade fixed the latch on the barn door. She didn't write about sorrow. She didn't write about the road behind her. She wrote about the garden she meant to plant, and the way the porch creaked when he stepped onto it after dark, and the way his hand found hers without needing to ask. Inside the cabin, she set the journal on the shelf beside the Bible and turned to him. "I want to build something here," she said. "Not just fix what's broken. I want a life with you in it." Wade stepped forward, slow and sure. "That's all I've wanted since the day you sat across from me with nothing but hunger in your eyes and still found room to say thank you." She reached for him then, and this time, she didn't hold back. He wrapped his arms around her waist, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm beneath his ribs. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, soft as breath. And inside, where two hands met in quiet promise, a forever began to take root one neither of them had seen coming, but both now held with open hearts and steady hands. By early September, the light had softened, and the mornings came edged with chill. Sylvie stood in the barn loft, sleeves rolled down and pinned at the wrist, sorting through a crate of dried herbs she'd gathered from the creek's edge. A pale green scent hung in the air, sweet yarrow and wild mint, dried slow on the rafters. She moved with a quiet focus, her mind turned toward the root cellar Wade had started digging below the north slope. Below, he hitched the team to the plow, readying the soil for winter rye. When she climbed down the ladder, he looked up and wiped his hands on a scrap of linen. "You ever work a cellar door?" he asked, nodding toward the foundation he'd been shaping from river stones. She brushed hay from her skirt. "No, but I've watched one come apart in a storm. Think I'd rather help build than patch." He handed her a square of timber. "Then you're hired." They worked side by side until the sun crept over the ridge and settled high enough to warm the backs of their necks. Sylvie measured the angles while Wade drove the nails, their voices low and practical. Sometime near midday, she paused, holding a beam steady while he adjusted the hinge. "What made you stay here back when you could have gone anywhere?" she asked, eyes on the grain of the wood. He didn't stop working. "My father built this house after the war. Said land wouldn't leave you like people could. I guess I held to that." She nodded. "You believe that still?" "I believe land stays if you treat it right. Same with people." She didn't answer, just passed him the next nail. That evening they sat behind the cabin, boots off, feet in the grass still warm from the day. Sylvie leaned back on her hands, watching the last of the daylight fall behind the ridge. Wade had brought out a tin of blackberries he'd traded for in town, and they passed it between them, eating in companionable silence. "You ever think about leaving again?" he asked, voice quiet. She turned her head. "No, not anymore." "Why not?" She hesitated. "Because I stopped looking for something better than this." He nodded, biting into a berry. "I'm glad." She leaned closer, just enough to brush her shoulder against his arm. "I used to think forever was something other people got. Folks with softer hands and stories that didn't twist sideways. You think different now." "I do." Wade shifted his weight, turning to face her more fully. "I've been thinking about what comes next, not just the rye and the cellar, something more." Sylvie folded her legs beneath her. "Tell me." "I want to marry you." Her breath caught, but he held her gaze. "Not because you need a place, not because it's what folks expect, because I want you beside me for good, because I want to build our winters and springs together." She didn't answer right away. The wind had picked up, rustling the grass, and she listened to it as if it might steady her heartbeat. Then she reached out, took his hand and placed it over her chest. "Wade Ellison," she said, voice steady. "I didn't come here looking for a life. I came here trying not to die from the one I lost. But now I want what you want." He didn't say anything, just pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers, and let the quiet speak for them both. That night, after the lantern was turned down and the fire had burned to embers, Wade took a ring from his mother's old sewing box. Silver, with a small turquoise stone set in the center. He placed it on the table in front of her without ceremony. "It's not new," he said. She touched it with reverence. "It's perfect." They didn't set a date. They didn't need to. The promise had already settled into the walls of the cabin, into the earth beneath their feet. A life was being built not from the pieces of what had been broken, but from the slow, steady work of two people choosing one another each morning, each dusk, and all the quiet moments between. The first frost came late that October, clinging silver along the fence rails and turning the creek's edge to glass by sunrise. Sylvie rose before the light, tying her shawl close as she stepped out into the cold. The rye had taken root, rows of green pushing from the black earth, and the cellar door Wade had built with her help stood firm near the slope, dusted white at the hinges. Inside, Wade was grinding coffee beans by hand, the fire catching in the stove behind him. He looked up when she stepped back in, rubbing warmth into her fingers. "I've been thinking," he said, voice still soft from sleep. "About the old loft." She tilted her head. "What about it? It's tall enough for a second room. Could put a wall up, maybe build a shelf or two. Thought it might make a fine space, for after we're wed." She set her gloves on the table. "You want to keep sleeping on the floor," he grinned, eyes crinkling. "No, ma'am, I want a place where we can write our own days. Not just use the ones someone else left behind." She poured 2 tin cups of coffee and handed him one. "Then we'll build it, you and me." They married under a cottonwood tree, bare now, its limbs a dark lace against the sky. Preacher from the next town rode in by wagon, and Wade's neighbor, Mrs. Cartwright, lent her Sunday hat and a handful of dried lavender tied with twine. No music, no crowd, just the two of them, hand in hand, and the mountain wind running low through the grass. Afterward, Wade led her back to the cabin, their boots crunching over frost-tipped leaves. He opened the door for her, same as always, but this time she stepped inside knowing it was hers too. The quilt on the bed had been turned down, clean and waiting. A single white feather rested on the pillow. "I found it this morning," Wade said, nodding to it. "Figured it meant something." She touched the feather, then looked at him. "It does." That winter, the snow came heavy and slow, laying thick over the land until the fences disappeared and the path to the barn had to be stomped fresh each morning. They stayed close, fell into a rhythm that felt older than either of them. Wade chopped wood while Sylvie learned to make soap from lye and fat. He taught her to whittle, and she taught him to sew a button without cursing. One night in December, after the fire had burned low and the wind howled through the chimney, Sylvie lay against Wade's chest, fingers tracing the seam of his shirt. "You want children?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "I think I want what comes from us. Whatever shape it takes." She nodded against his collarbone. "I'd like that too." By March, the river had thawed, and the first shoots of wild onion pushed through the warming soil. Sylvie knelt beside the garden rows, planting with care, her belly just beginning to swell beneath her apron. Wade built a fence around the beds, not because he feared animals, but because he wanted it protected. That spring, they welcomed a son. Born in the same cabin that had once held only silence, his cry filled the room like a hymn. Wade caught him with steady hands, wrapped him in the same quilt his mother had sewn decades before. They named him Samuel. In the evenings, Sylvie rocked the baby on the porch while Wade read aloud from a weathered novel, his voice carrying through the pine's sweet dusk. They lit lanterns with the same match each night, took turns rising with their son, and spoke in the soft tones of people who had already lived through loss, and now understood what it meant to stay. Years passed. The rye grew tall each season. More children followed, 2 girls with strong lungs and muddy feet, and a second boy who loved the creek more than his boots. They outgrew the old cabin, so Wade and Sylvie added on, one beam at a time, until it held every laugh, every cry, every moment of their shared days. By the time their hair turned silver, the porch swing had worn smooth beneath their weight. They sat there most evenings, listening to the wind in the trees, watching the sun fall behind the same ridge where they'd once stood silent and unsure. Wade reached for her hand, still calloused from work, still warm in his. "You remember the first time I saw you?" Sylvie smiled. "You didn't ask who I was, just fed me and gave me a place to rest." He kissed the back of her fingers. "Best decision I ever made." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You gave me something I never thought I'd have." He looked out over the land they'd built together. "You gave it shape." And so they stayed, growing roots deeper than any fence post, their love quiet and steady, the kind that lasts through storms and silence alike. They had no need for declarations, no hunger for more, because what they had was whole. They were home. Always.